Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Van Dyck. I'm an attorney at Cogent Law Group. Thank you all for joining today. We're here to talk about the prospect of cannabis being rescheduled on the Controlled Substances Act and what that may mean for financial institutions contemplating cannabis banking and cannabis lending in particular. Before we get into the presentation itself, just one or two housekeeping details. I'm expecting this presentation to last very roughly about 45 minutes, leaving 15 minutes for Q&A. If people have questions during my presentation, please don't be bashful. Please ask away, and I'll try to get to them as and when. And I'm going to give you my contact details at the end of this presentation as well. So if following the presentation you have any questions or comments and want to email or call me directly, again, please don't hesitate to do that. So maybe we can move to the next slide. So just a few background details about me. I'm a former financial regulator, having worked at the Maine Bureau of Financial Institutions from 2006 to 2014. And I was the staff attorney there. And during my last year there, in 2014, as most folks on this call probably know, the FinCEN guidance on marijuana banking was issued, and we had lots of questions from our regulated banks and credit unions in Maine about that FinCEN guidance. And we actually went around the state and presented to them on our views about what that FinCEN guidance meant. As folks know, what the FinCEN guidance meant back then and what it means now are two very, very different things. But we'll talk about that perhaps later on. For the last 2 years, I've been a partner at Cogent Law Group. And Cogent Law, we had one of the things that I do primarily is I advise banks and credit unions on structuring and managing banking programs that balance growth and risk mitigation. I'm a Maine qualified attorney, so I also act as an external general counsel for banks and credit unions located here in Maine. And then following my time as a financial regulator, prior to Cogent Law, I worked at a financial institution for close to 10 years. And during my time there, we built one of the nation's first cannabis banking programs, which turned into a very highly profitable program. Our board of directors went back and forth on lending. We never quite got there, but just on the deposit side, the fee income that we were uh, deriving from our cannabis banking program amounted to a full 25% of our total ROA at the time that I left that financial institution. So those are just a few words about my background. I think anybody here who's part of a financial institution knows, you wear many hats. When I was at that financial institution, I was the general counsel, I was the BSA officer, I was the chief risk officer. I oversaw the vendor management program, and I also addressed elevated customer and vendor and complaints we had regarding our vendors, contractual disputes. So anyway, those are just a few more words about myself. So I essentially do one of five things for banks and credit unions. I assist financial institutions who are not yet in the cannabis banking space, but who are looking to get into the cannabis space. I offer board presentations, talking to boards about what the risks are involved in cannabis banking and how those risks can best be managed. I can offer policies and procedures and risk assessments tailored to your particular financial institution. I can advise on how your BSA department and your your business departments should be structured and how should be working together with each other. And I also assist in exam preparedness for your BSA program because rest assured, and those of you who already have a cannabis banking program know this, your examiners will be taking a very, very close look at this high risk program. The other thing I do for institutions that are already in the cannabis banking on the depository side, I offer advice on those looking to expand into the lending side. As folks here who are familiar with the FinCEN guidance knows, the FinCEN guidance doesn't make a distinction between lending and deposit services. But having said that, there are additional risks associated with the lending piece. And again, I present to boards on the risks associated with cannabis lending, assist with their policies and procedures and risk assessments. And I also help with the loan documentation. There do need to be specific covenants with your commercial loan documentation geared specifically to the cannabis industry. And much to my chagrin, I have worked with some financial institutions that are using their standard commercial loan agreements without considering the specific covenants that should be in place. I've also worked with a few financial institutions who've gotten into a little bit of trouble with their regulators because of their cannabis banking programs, and they have sought me out looking for remediation. And so I've worked with them to get them back up and running with their cannabis banking programs in a compliant way. Lately, I've worked with a couple of financial institutions that have extremely well developed cannabis banking programs, but for one reason or another, that their programs have gotten bogged down in some inefficiencies, perhaps too much, back and forth between departments, and perhaps taking or erring on the side of caution in terms of making sure that they're compliant. And so I've advised them on some efficiencies that they can adopt to save on costs, while at the same time, you know, ensuring that they remain compliant in the eyes of their examiners. I also am on call. One of the things I do pride myself in is being accessible to my clients. And all of my clients have my cell number, my email. And if they have any specific questions relating to their cannabis-related program, I try to get back to them as quickly as possible with a response. I've had some financial institutions reach out to me who've had some kind of odd recommendations from their auditors on their cannabis banking program, and I've tried to steer both the auditors and the bank in what I think is the correct way. Okay, I think we can move on. So here's the agenda for today. I'm going to talk very briefly about the current treatment of cannabis under the Controlled Substances Act. Then I'm going to talk about the recent attempts to reschedule cannabis under the Biden administration. From there, we're going to get into what I think is the more interesting part of this discussion, and that is, the recent developments under the Trump administration and what those develop means, and going on from there, what those recent statements coming out of the current administration mean, and reading the tea leaves. What does that mean for rescheduling? Um, and then I'm going to be talking about th there are three ways in which cannabis could be rescheduled under the Controlled Substances Act, and I'm going to talk about those three ways, and what the rough timelines would be depending on which of the ways in which the cannabis is rescheduled. I'm going to talk about 280E of the tax code, and what those tax implications for cannabis businesses mean if it gets rescheduled. And then I'm going to be talking about rescheduling again from a financial institution perspective. What does that mean? What would rescheduling mean from a risk perspective? And then I will also talk about what rescheduling for financial institutions means from a market perspective, because those two things are very, very different. And then I will be talking specifically about rescheduling as it pertains to offering commercial loans to cannabis businesses. And then after that, I'll be talking about what does not change for financial institutions with rescheduling. We've still got that FinCEN guidance in place, and I'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to that slide. And then I'll say a few words about the Safer Banking Act, which has been languishing in Congress for 8 years now, and the MORE Act, again, which has been in Congress for several years, and what the implications are for those two bills uh, if rescheduling were to occur. And again, there's a difference of opinion about that, and I'll get into those opinions when we get to that slide. So that's basically going to be the structure of this webinar. And again, questions along the way, please feel free to ask either during my presentation or during the Q&A period following that. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I think most people know this already. Marijuana is now listed as a Schedule 1 drug under the Controlled Substances Act. And what does that mean? It means that as far as the federal government is concerned, marijuana has no accepted medical use. It has a very high potential for abuse. And because of the fact that it's Schedule 1, research is still prohibited on marijuana. Other examples of Schedule 1 substances are heroin, ecstasy, and LSD. And this all happened, in 1970 and 71 during the Nixon administration, when Nixon proclaimed his war on drugs. And if folks are on this call who are as old as I am will remember those public service announcements on TV. This was a cause célèbre for Nancy Reagan, and it was those PSA announcements were just say no to drugs. Recently, well, within the last couple of years, while unearthing some of the Nixon archives, it was revealed that even Nixon had mixed feelings about lumping cannabis in with these much more serious drugs. But at the end of the day, he felt that by putting cannabis on another schedule under the Controlled Substances Act, that would send the wrong signal to the youth in America. So that's where we're at now. Well, we're 50 years on from there, but it's still listed as Schedule 1. So let's move on to the next slide. So, as folks here probably also well know, during President Biden's final year in office, May 2024, he directed his federal agencies to issue a notice of proposed rulemaking. This was back in late April, May of 2024, to reschedule cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3 on the Controlled Substances Act. And just to give you some perspective on Schedule 3 substances, that one example of a Schedule 3 substance is Tylenol coated with codeine. Uh, and During those months, unfortunately, there was some procedural wrangling. There were allegations of inappropriate private communications going on between the parties to the rulemaking. And as a result, the process got very, very stalled. And then Trump was elected. And following that, and because of that, that rulemaking process halted entirely. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Okay, this is where things get interesting. Recent developments under the Trump administration. While Trump was on the campaign trail, he spoke very positively about marijuana legalization. As a Florida resident, he was in favor of Amendment 3 in Florida, which would have permitted adult use cannabis in that state. Um, and again, during his campaign, he made various other pro-marijuana statements. Um, and then Since being in office, on August the 11th, when asked about marijuana, he stated that his administration was, quote, end quote, considering rescheduling and hoped to make a more formal announcement in the coming weeks. So you have to parse the words there. He's not making any kind of commitment about cannabis being rescheduled. But he did say, and Pat Bondi was in the room uh, with him at the time as Attorney General, and he looked over to her and she nodded in affirmation that they were going to be looking at this. But we've not heard anything more about rescheduling specifically. But then on September the 29th of this year, or sorry, on September the 28th, Trump went on his Truth Social and made a fairly long video, extolling the virtues of cannabinoids, um, and he actually endorsed the Medicare coverage of CBD. A day later, on September the 29th, the Department of Justice under Bondi issued a memo indicating a more rigorous prosecutorial stance toward possession or use of marijuana on federal property. And again, those of you who are familiar with the FinCEN guidance knows that possession or use of marijuana on federal property is already one of the Cole memo priorities. So there were, in my email eyewash, there was a lot of consternation about that. I wasn't as concerned as others, given the fact that it really is just a reiteration of one of the Cole memo priorities. And then very recently, on November the 12th, Trump signed the spending bill, which included complete, almost a virtual crackdown on the hemp industry. I'm actually doing another webinar specifically devoted to the uh, the ramifications of the spending bill as it relates to the hemp industry on December the 9th through the Association of Cannabis Bankers. And I invite any financial institution who's on this call to sign up for that, particularly if you have a hemp account portfolio. Um, and again, that it seemed completely contradictory to his earlier statement about, extolling the virtues of hemp. Um, and one thing that I missed on this presentation was, and I think is a very important one, is item number 6, and that is on September the 29th, the DOJ made a court filing in federal court to extend proceedings on rescheduling cannabis until January 27th, 2026. So, what I'm about to say, please take with some grain of salt, because there have been so many times when I have tried to predict Washington and have been proven wrong. But I, based on all of this back and forth on cannabis during the Trump administration, I do think that it's a question of if, or sorry, it's a question of when, not if cannabis is resettled. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself because my next slide is reading the tea leaves. If we could get on to that, uh, uh, great, thanks. So, as I just said, we're getting very, very mixed signals coming from the Trump administration on rescheduling. Unfortunately, the GOP party is politicizing marijuana. It has become a very political um, topic. The other thing to bear in mind is that Trump of late has been much more focused on international affairs, both with more recently with South America and with Israel and Gaza. So, in the grand scheme of things, given what he's been contending with of late, cannabis and rescheduling cannabis, uh, might be looked upon by the administration as kind of a small potato issue, something that uh, they're in no rush to move forward with. The other thing, again, these are kind of political considerations. The GOP did get thumped during the midterms, and rescheduling would be a politically savvy move, despite the GOP's protestations over rescheduling. Um, the polls, the Gallup polls have consistently shown, a majority of Americans uh, wanting to have marijuana uh, legalized. And anyway, rescheduling would be a step in that direction and could very well win some votes. On the other side, you've got some very, very strong lobbyists in Washington, big pharma, as well as the alcohol lobby, um, who are against hemp and cannabis. They view those industries as a threat to their own industries. And again, just going back to the spending bill, the provision in the spending bill, which basically made 95% of hemp products illegal, that was thrown in because of Mitch McConnell, Kentucky senator, who's very beholden to the alcohol industry there. So that's, again, another thing to consider when debating whether or not cannabis is going to be rescheduled. I had heard Getting to the last bullet point, I had heard in the last uh, 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 in September that their cannabis could actually be descheduled, uh, and those but those uh, whispers seem to have gone away. So I don't think that's going to happen. If anything, I think it's going to be rescheduling, not descheduling. And um, and again, I think it's really, in my view, I think it's a question of when, not if. And I think, if it does occur, it's going to, there's a likelihood that it will happen in 2026. Um, Raphael, I'm not seeing the slides on my uh, screen. I don't know if the others are. Hey, Raphael, are you there? We'll just wait a moment. Thank you, Lauren. Yep. Yeah, so the others aren't seeing the slides either. We'll just pause for a moment. Jessica, I don't know if you're there, if possible for you to help too. Okay, there we are. I think we're back up and running. Thank you so much, Raphael and Jessica. Really appreciate that. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. Okay, I'd like to address the various ways in which rescheduling could happen. Uh, uh, so there was a bill actually introduced by Gregory Stube. He's a Republican Florida congressman. He introduced the 123 bill in Florida. So one, I don't know I have not seen anything recently about that bill, so I don't believe it's moving forward anywhere. But that bill would basically be a legislative attempt to reschedule cannabis. Uh, as we've seen already from the Biden administration, the administration could direct federal agency rulemaking with a notice and comment period. And that's probably the most likely approach if we see rescheduling under the Trump administration. There is also provision for fast track rulemaking without a comment period, and that has actually happened before with the rescheduling of another drug under the Controlled Substances Act. Pretty uncommon, but possible. And I've been talking to a few other attorneys about the provisions in the Controlled Substances Act, and they have pointed me to provisions in that act which they believe would actually permit Trump to reschedule cannabis via executive order, basically by directing Bondi to reschedule uh, cannabis to Schedule 3 within 60 days of his executive order. And that the executive orders seem to be, flavor of the month these days. So those are the four ways in which it could happen. And, depending on which way uh, President Trump elects to reschedule, if he does elect to reschedule, the timing of the timing would vary enormously. Federal agency rulemaking with notice and comment. That takes a long time. There's a notice of proposed rulemaking. There's time allowed for comments. There's generally a hearing involved, and following the comment, the notice of comment period, and then following that, the agency takes into account all of the comments, testimony during the hearing, revises the rule based on those comments, and then the issuance, the rule is the final rule is issued, but generally speaking, there is a the effective date of that rule is sometime beyond the actual issuance of the final rule. So that can take many months before we have an effective rule. Fast track rulemaking without the notice and comment period would be much, much quicker. And then executive order would be essentially a 2 month period, or up to a 2 month period. So that's the kind of the timing for those three ways in which rescheduling could happen. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So, what are the tax implications for cannabis businesses if rescheduling happens? I'm going to go to the bottom of the slide and just read word for word the language in the tax code. No deduction or credit shall be allowed for any amount paid or incurred during the taxable year in carrying on any trade or business if such trade or business or the activities which comprise such trade or business consists of trafficking in controlled substances. And then the most important part is in brackets, within the meaning of Schedule 1 and 2 of the Controlled Substances Act, which is prohibited by federal law or the law of any state in which such trade or business is conducted. So what that is telling us is that the prohibition from deducting expenses depends on whether the business is involved in a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 substance. Okay, let's move on to the next slide here. So, rescheduling is obviously good news for cannabis businesses on all fronts. Uh, the but being alleviated from the 280E tax burden, and again, that would apply to both adult use and medical use, or a good argument, I should say, that it applies to both. That's great news from a financial perspective for cannabis businesses. But there are complications involved in this because if marijuana gets rescheduled to Schedule 3, there is a registration requirement that businesses involved in Schedule 3 substances obtain a DEA license. And right now, there is no regulatory pathway for medical cannabis businesses to become federally compliant. So without a DEA licensure, the designation of marijuana as a Schedule 3 substance doesn't automatically confer a federally legal status for medical cannabis businesses. So anyway, I am not a tax attorney. I'm not a tax advisor. But for any cannabis businesses that are listening to this, and we do have a rescheduling, or rescheduling does take place, I would advise them to seek specific tax advice on the treatment. And then, we have to parse out adult use cannabis businesses, even though, they would be conducting business with a Schedule 3 substance. They are always going to operate outside of a federally legal space, despite rescheduling. So again, even though they're no longer dealing with a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 substance, they won't be they won't they will be operating legally from a state perspective, but illegally from a federal perspective. And again, I would implore any cannabis businesses, whether they're medical or adult use, to get specific tax advice uh, in the event of rescheduling. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So, what does rescheduling mean for financial institutions? I'm going to talk about first, from a risk perspective, and then my next slide is going to be talking about it from a market perspective. I do believe that, moving cannabis to Schedule 3 is going to uh, mean some reputational de-risking, and that's a good thing for banks and credit unions because reputation is very, very important. Having said that, I have a spiel about, the risks, and I have always been of the view that reputational risk for getting into cannabis banking, that's a fairly small circle of risk in the grand scheme of things. But having said that, dealing with businesses that are working with a substance that's analogous to Tylenol, that's a definitely a reputational de-risking. I certainly think there's going to be legal de-risking as well. And again, I sounds somewhat strange coming from an attorney, but I have viewed the legal risks associated with cannabis banking as again one of the smaller circles of risk. There has not been any uh, prosecution put forward uh, by state or federal prosecutors against a bank or credit union for banking cannabis businesses. But I think that risk again becomes even smaller if cannabis is moved to a Schedule 3 substance. And then what about the third risk? And this is the large circle of risk in my Venn diagram, the compliance and BSA de-risking. The FinCEN guidance doesn't go away. I've got a slide on that coming up. But it will be interesting to see whether or not the financial examiners take a somewhat less stringent approach to cannabis banking programs if if cannabis is rescheduled to Schedule 3. So I've got a question mark next to that. I I don't ever want to speak for the examiners. So let's go on to the next slide. So what does rescheduling mean from a financial institution perspective, or from a market perspective for financial institutions? And obviously, I think more banks and credit unions are going to jump into the cannabis banking space, uh, and that's going to mean greater competition and from both financial institutions and non-financial institution entities. That in turn is going to put downward pressure on both fee and for those FIs that are lending interest income. Um, I think you're going to see a movement toward more bank shopping on the part of cannabis businesses. The days when a cannabis business only had one financial institution to go to are over. And with more and more financial institutions opening up on cannabis, you're going to see bank shopping uh, and closer analysis of what the costs are of banking at a financial institution by those cannabis businesses. And because of that, you're going to see less uh, portfolio stability among with your cannabis account programs. And banks are going to have to respond to that. Banks and credit unions are going to have to respond to that. And I think there's going to be pressure, and I know some financial institutions are already doing this and doing it very, very well, but there is going to be pressure to provide value-added services for your cannabis uh, customers, concierge services, fee capping. CEOs of cannabis businesses, as of all businesses, like to have certainty with their budgets. So fee capping is something that's a very attractive proposition for CEOs and senior management of cannabis businesses. Smart Safe offerings, offering provisional credit to cannabis businesses. Again, that creates strong affinity with cannabis members or customers. And then also currency transport offerings. Again, these businesses will continue to operate in a very, very cash intensive environment. So, anything that can ease the burden of all of that cash handling, whether it be by smart safe or currency transport services, those sorts of things mean a lot to cannabis businesses. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So let's, a few words about cannabis lending here. As I mentioned before, with the prospect of cannabis businesses no longer, or likely no longer being burdened by 280 of the tax code, that's going to mean that cannabis businesses are going to be much more profitable and therefore better lending prospects. I have always been of the view that, if you're in the cannabis banking space on the depository side, you're already meeting a lot of the compliance and BSA burdens, so associated with cannabis banking. The risks on the lending side kind of shift over to the underwriting and the collateral risks associated with lending. And so I do see that, if they're more profitable, their balance sheets are going to be better and you're going to have diminished underwriting risks. But at the same time, you're going to have more financial institutions willing to jump into the cannabis lending space. And again, that as on the depository, the fee side, that's going to mean downward pressure on interest rate pricing. And again, cannabis businesses are going to be more apt to bank shop for commercial loans with the prospect of rescheduling. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Yeah, so what would not change for financial institutions? I've already alluded to this before, but this is a really important uh, aspect to keep in mind. The FinCEN, the 2014 FinCEN guidance, remains in place. There's been a lot of criticism already, both in legal circles as well as by policymakers, that FinCEN has not already revised its FinCEN guidance. It's now 12 years old. We've got a majority of states now that have legalized marijuana in one form or another. We've got a majority of the US citizens who want to see marijuana legalized, or at least regulation and legislation relaxed concerning marijuana. But in spite of all of these developments over the last 12 years, that FinCEN guidance remains in place. And as all of the bankers on this webcast know, that means the compliance obligations, the very burdensome compliance obligations relating to onboarding, the continued due diligence and the account monitoring, and last but not least, those rolling SAR filings, the limited priority and termination marijuana filings, all of that remains in place. even if rescheduling occurs. So one of the key questions I have is, will rescheduling result in a revised guidance from FinCEN? I do think it's going to place pressure, much more pressure on FinCEN to revise that guidance. One possible way forward for FinCEN would be to take away the requirement for financial institutions to file marijuana limited filings when there is no suspicious activity being seen, when none of the Cole memo priorities have been implicated during a filing period. But at the same time, maintaining the enhanced monitoring of those accounts. Um, a lot of people, think that, with rescheduling or even descheduling, and I don't think that's going to occur, but even if it were to occur, these accounts, just become like any other business account. But the ongoing reality is that cannabis accounts are always going to be a higher risk account. They're dealing in a highly regulated industry with licensure requirements, and they're also cash intensive, which means that the chances for money laundering are greater. So I think, regardless of what happens on the rescheduling front, regardless of what happens with the FinCEN guidance, the accounts are always going to be there are going to be extra compliance requirements associated with these accounts, and that's going to be something very important to communicate with your cannabis banking members or customers, because I do think that there's going to be some confusion, I think, among the industry that, if and when rescheduling occurs, that, there's no reason to fee on the accounts or to charge a premium on interest rates for the accounts. Uh, Banks and credit unions, they charge for their time and they charge for their risk. And there will always be some enhanced risk associated with cannabis accounts. So that's a very important thing to remember. Okay, let's move on. I think we got one more slide, and then we've got time for some questions if there are any. So what would be the effect of rescheduling on the federal bill? So there are two that have been in Congress now for some time. There's the Safer Banking Act. I can remember 8 years ago when I was working at a financial institution and the Safer Banking Act had passed the House. And I remember, running up to our CEO and, sounding the alarm bells that, if the Safer Banking Act gets passed, uh, that would provide financial institutions with a legal safe harbor. And that represents diminished risk. And if there's diminished risk, there's a good argument for reducing the our fee structure on that account. Anyway, that never happened. It never and continues not to happen. And then there's also the MORE Act, which is a kind of a more comprehensive act, and that would in fact deschedule cannabis and provides greater deference to state regulation of cannabis. So the two arguments that I've heard are A, that if rescheduling in whatever, however that would take place, if that were to occur, that would possibly increase momentum in Congress to pass, at least one of these bills. What I've also heard from some legal commentators is that rescheduling could lessen the pressure on Congress to move forward with these bills. My own view on this is that I think rescheduling would put some pressure on Congress to at least pass the Safer Banking Act. which would again allow for greater financial integration for cannabis businesses. There's still a relatively small minority of banks and credit unions that are banking cannabis businesses. And I can't see any rhyme or reason to, keeping that bottleneck on financial integration if cannabis gets rescheduled. So that's my own view on that. I do think rescheduling would might increase the chances of passage of at least the Safer Banking Act. Okay, I think we can move on to the next slide, and I think we might have. I think that's it. Yeah. Listen, I want to thank everyone who attended today. To be part of this conversation is very, very important. That telephone number there, that's my cell number. Please don't hesitate to call me if you have any questions at any time. There's my email address as well. Again, I want to thank you all. I'm going to open it up now. We've got a few minutes for questions. I want to be respectful of people's time as well. But if anyone has any questions, please feel free to please feel free to speak up. I think there's some chats here. Let me just. Okay, we've got a few questions here. Biggest challenge an institution faces when evaluating whether to bank cannabis businesses. Again, I think the biggest challenge is overcoming the regulatory expectations concerning cannabis accounts. That FinCEN guidance it's not a regulation. It doesn't have any uh, definitions. It doesn't have any official staff commentary. So there's a lot of uncertainty built into cannabis banking because both the regulators and the financial institutions are working with a kind of an inadequate tool for banking cannabis. So I think the uncertainty surrounding the regulatory expectations, I think, is one of the key issues. Um, So, building systems for implementation, that's something that I work very, very closely with institutions on. The is, again, I've worked in a financial institution myself. I know that people are being pulled in all sorts of different directions, but I can very easily fast track this program by getting some policies and procedures up in place for you, talking about cannabis banking with your board, getting your board members in a position so that they understand the risks and are comfortable with the risks. I talk to them specifically about all of the risk mitigation strategies that a bank can employ for banking cannabis. There are also, some very reputable vendors who offer compliance software specifically on cannabis banking. And again, that takes a lot of the burden off the financial institution, creates a lot of efficiencies for financial institutions, and thereby reduces costs for financial institutions. So, Raphael, have I got any more questions here from folks? Okay, I think I'm gonna let's just wait one more minute, see if we get any more questions. And again, I want to thank everyone, and I don't want anyone to be bashful about reaching out to me with any questions. And by the way, if anybody here on this call has a hemp banking program, uh, please feel free to reach out to me on that separate issue because as I mentioned, alluded to earlier, there's been some a very, very significant development regarding hemp because of passage of the spending bill. And that in turn has had very significant ramifications for financial institutions who are banking hemp. Okay, so I think that would all depend on, what the question is if financial reform happened tomorrow, what area of compliance framework would require the most immediate adjustment? And again, I think, if the rescheduling happened, I think, Ian, I don't think that anything would really change in terms of a bank's or a credit union's policies and procedures, because that FinCEN guidance, which really dictates, that's the Bible for banks' policies and procedures. So I think, from a policy and procedure perspective, rescheduling would not have an enormous effect on the day-to-day operations of a financial institution's cannabis banking program. I do think it represents de-risking, and I also think from a market perspective, it may require some rethinking of your fee program and some of the offerings that a financial institution can offer. Okay. Again, listen, thank you everyone for attending today. Really appreciate your attendance. Great questions from everyone. And again, please feel free to reach out if you have any further questions or want to discuss anything with me, whether it be cannabis banking related or hemp banking related. Please feel free to reach out. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.